You all know how good a speaker Stewart is. It's kind of a tough act to follow. I want to thank the Morris family for what you've done here. It's a very special place in Houston. And it stands for something very important in all of our lives in society. Kenneth and Ernest, thank you for having me too, and all of you who may regret that you came. I appreciate you showing up. And I wanted to just kind of maybe start with a couple of questions, if you don't mind. One is, if I could ask you to raise your hands, who thinks that actions are more important than words? Cool. I certainly think they are too, because we have a lot of people that talk nonsense and their actions are actually the only thing that I really depend on. But I actually want to talk about both things today. It was interesting when I asked that question of my UT MBA class last Monday, actually. I asked them about that because we were dealing with some things with regard to some readings that we had gone through on David Brooks's Road to Character, which some of you may have read. And this wonderful, wonderful brainiac physics/everything MIT guy said, well, now wait a minute. He said, what if you're not alive? What if you're a great author or a great philosopher and we read your words and we never see you act, and yet you have a huge impact on our lives? And it drew me to the thought that, well, poets as well, right? We read poetry. We read books all the time where we don't know the person. And so they're clearly in the right forum and in the right situation is a place for both of them in a very powerful way. Second question is, how many of you tried to live out your faith or your spiritual beliefs in your personal work or in your student lives and maybe failed occasionally? Thank God. So I'm amongst friends in terms of trying to overcome the shortcomings in the human condition. So when Stewart introduces me, he only knows about half of what he needed to. So we're going to talk, as you know, today about our spiritual lives within our work and within our student lives for those of you that are younger that were nice enough to come here as well. And I think that most of us would agree, based on the answer to the second question, is that we're striving, however imperfectly, to try to fulfill that spiritual purpose. And that we're trying to improve the world and we're trying to live virtuous lives, as imperfectly as we may do that sometimes. And from my standpoint, that isn't easy. I don't know if it is for some of you. If it is, that's awesome. But then when I reflect on it, I'm not sure that that's part of the plan. I'm not sure that part of the plan isn't to test free will and free choice through challenges. And I suspect that the creator of the universe didn't put us here to be comfortable. That's just a guess. And it sure isn't most of the time. I think the world, as I understand it as a scientist, is intentionally too imperfect, whether you're a behavioral or a physical scientist. It's filled with a lot of struggle and suffering. Fortunately, many of us are able to go through that and come out on the other side. Some are not. And it's a terrible shame. But there's also great joy. And for many of us who believe in it, there's a promise of an incredibly sweet afterlife. We all know that our faith, our spiritual purpose, is a very personal matter. And yet what I've found over the years is that making it a communal endeavor creates real magic. And it's even outside of biblical groups like many of you may participate in, which is so important to your faith integrity. And today we need people with spiritual purpose, in my view, desperately in society, who can lead others that are really, in my view, searching for that and not for just jobs. We all come by our faith and spiritual purpose differently. It's expressed in different ways. It comes to us in different times and stages. There's plenty of seats down here too. And if I sound like a priest, that's okay. Because in the Catholic faith, we always try to go in the back so the priest couldn't throw something at us. In my personal case, that faith journey was one that started at a very young age. I had a very faith-filled, very religiously circumspect father who was a Catholic Christian, and an agnostic Catholic-raised mother, stunningly, who would have the priests over every Sunday night because she felt sorry for them, not because she liked the Catholic Church. And for me, that was a perfect combination for both practicing my faith tradition and questioning it properly, because my mother was about 10 times smarter than my father intellectually. And I thought maybe she knew something I needed to learn. And I do think, like many of you, that most of my behavior at work, most of my behavior in school, reflected at least an intense desire to be virtuous toward others and to make the world better, as often as I might have failed. But my faith was really only integrated into that work life, that study life, in a very individual way, without openly inviting others to enter into the world as I saw it. As a Catholic, you might appreciate, especially at my vintage, that I had never read the Bible until I got to college. At the Air Force Academy, I fell in with a group of Episcopalian cadets, and when it was all male. And because we weren't allowed to go anywhere, anytime, and we're in prison, we every Friday night would get together and they taught me how to read the Bible. But it was still very individual after that one experience, very intense experience in daily Mass with my fellow cadets. And I think that that was a missed opportunity for me. In my late 30s, I stopped reading about books on business leadership, and I focused my free time on studying the histories of the great faith traditions and the writings of or about great moral leaders and theologians. Perhaps the universe knew that what I needed to lead global companies well was not business skills, but greater moral and religious literacy. I thought from the age of 21, as an internationally based worker in a US-based company, some of you may remember who've had touched the oil business, there was a company called Amoco, which was Standard of Indiana, one of the big seven sisters, that got swallowed by BP eventually. That's who I worked for in a variety of places, both in South America and in Europe and in Africa. And that for me, studying comparative theology and other religious traditions would help in that international working environment, in addition to the fact that we were all fully aware back in the 70s that our own country was becoming much more diverse religiously and ethnically and culturally. And that somehow that knowledge would help me to understand from whence others came and how they might view, importantly, what many in America, including myself, thought was special about Christianity. But words about my spiritual beliefs were kept mostly private unless someone asked me about them. And I firmly believe that by setting a good example, the old phrase about making them jealous and asking you why you approached most days so enthusiastically would be enough. And they would come to me and ask me, what is it that motivates you? Why do you try to give credit to others? Why are you a good team player? What's so positive about your life? And they did occasionally. I didn't feel I needed to tell them. But they probably didn't do it as much as I would have hoped they would have. And I think that's because I didn't in any deliberate way bring my faith in an authentic external fashion to my job. And I eventually realized that was a mistake. Belatedly, I did discern, probably wasn't praying properly, that in fact I should try to make a communal invitation to others at work and now start speaking about my spiritual beliefs, not just acting them out. I hope you don't wait that long or didn't wait that long. Now, I think that for many of us in the audience, at least two questions would come to mind. Two of them at least come to my mind. in a liberal secularist society like the one in which we live. And that is, can we safely speak about our faith and spiritual purpose in any institution, public or private? 2, is it a competitive disadvantage to direct our departments, our divisions, our entire institutions comporting with the principles or cardinal virtues of a faith tradition or set of spiritual beliefs? I suspect some of you in the audience have figured out really good answers to these 2 questions. My definitive answer is yes to being able to safely speak out, and definitely no to the competitive disadvantage question. In fact, I believe that it's a significant advantage to have strong spiritually held beliefs in the workplace. Let me briefly mention a few things that can be done by all of us in any department or any division of an institution, even without a corporate commitment from the top of that institution or the top of that enterprise. I've seen it done, not by me, but it works. First, develop a mission statement that speaks to not just what is the primary activity of the team you lead, but also why you and your teammates should be interested in even getting together at all. In other words, how does your piece of the puzzle help to make society better? This mission, when joined with your values, your team's values, which I'll speak to in a minute, can then become part of the spiritual mission for your team. To do God's work by serving others and making the world a better place. Second, develop that set of values. We had 10 in a prior institution I helped lead, and these values delineated what we as a management team held dear about communal life in our enterprise, including 1, to honor our faith and family obligations. I'll come back to that in a minute. 2, to be kind to our colleagues whether or not we liked them. 3, to be focused on long-term, not short-term results. That's obvious, but for stakeholders, not shareholders. And this is a public company. It's a very, very different connotation. 4, to act with integrity and without deception. That specifically does not include honesty, by the way. You will never see that in a value of any institution I lead, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. The key word is without deception. 5, to be competent and achieve something meaningful, or, tough as it may be willing to work somewhere else. Tough as it may be willing to work somewhere else. 6, to be team-oriented but desirous of champions. Someone who will be individualistic within the team setting, who stands for something, an idea, an innovative process, a moral issue. 8, to practice servant leadership. We'll come back to that. 9, to continuously improve by embracing different forms of failure. Continuously improve by embracing different forms of failure. If you fail differently every single time and better, you will beat everybody in business. And finally, not surprisingly, hold each other accountable for the first 9. Because sometimes we don't do that. We put them on the wall, and nobody in the management team invites anybody below them to actually tell them when they're not behaving. And yet, it can go one way. We asked for it to be the other way too, because we all need, as I call it, a mother. I think you can notice that none of those values included the word God. None of them included a specific religious tradition, but it included a reference to faith. As a recognition that many people bring a plethora of specific traditions or beliefs into the workplace. Importantly to us, the mention of faith confirms that we thought it was an important consideration in many people's lives and wanted to recognize that we understood that many viewed their faith and families as critical obligations at work at work. Another important dimension of our stated values was the inclusion of servant leadership, which I promised to return to. A term familiar to many Christians, which is replicated in many other faith and philosophical traditions. This principle is critical in the workplace because it helps define virtue and meaning-making at work. We are only good leaders if we lead by serving others. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s Day. And he is famous, at least in my mind, for saying that you don't need a pedigree. You don't need a law degree. You don't need a PhD, forgive me, all the professors. You can be the simplest, the least educated of humanity, and you can be a leader because all you need to do is serve others. Servant leadership is wanting others to succeed as much as you want yourself to succeed. It's that generosity of spirit. It is standing up for your team when they have the right idea, the right approach, or have shown great character and competence, even at the risk of your boss's displeasure. And in some cases, at the risk of your own promotion, and in some cases, at the risk of your own job. That's what we call moral fortitude, which all of us in this room understand, and which we all too seldom get to actually display. It's a blessing to be able to do it occasionally. This is when I think your faith can be a living example not only to others, but also to yourself and importantly to the Creator of the universe. A good example of this concept early in my career was a person who lived out the values of integrity, which I mentioned was one of the 10, and showed me about servant leadership at the same time. He was the CEO of a Kentucky-based company that a Texas-based company wanted to take over. They wanted to gain access to the Kentucky company's balance sheet and the improved operations that that company had over the one that was based in Texas. And the person who led that Texas-based company, which is very rare in Texas, was a person of very questionable character. He made a hostile bid to our board, and the premium offered was high enough that under Delaware law at the time, we could not ignore it. In those days, you had 3 choices under the law, which I don't think anybody here is as old as I am, but it was the case. You could not just say no, which you can today, with some limits. And those 3 choices had to be prosecuted in 30 days, or the company that made the hostile acquisition was effectively, technically taking over your company. The first, which is maybe obvious, is to go ahead and surrender, which would have been a death knell for both our employees and our community. The second was to make a counteroffer for the Texas company, which we were unwilling to do because we were unsure of the asset value and the character of the leadership. The third was to find what we called at the time a white knight. That is a company that would make an alternative and superior offer to the one that was made. In those days, management teams, oddly, did not have severance agreements, which is very common in today's world in both private and public companies. A board would simply put those into place once an offer was made by another company because they were interested in serving the shareholder interest, which under law they had to do at that point in time when the offer was made. And it was to make the management team indifferent between selling or merging the company, which was in the shareholder's best interest. So in our case, the board of the Kentucky-based company did exactly that. They offered the senior management, including me, 2 to 3 year payouts of base salary and bonus, as well as immediate vesting of all of our outstanding equity grants. But our CEO declined the offer. In his words, he thought it sent the wrong message to the employees. Since he was a relatively new CEO, I calculated later on that he turned down what probably doubled his net worth. It took him all of 2 seconds to say no. And not just for himself, by the way, but for all of his pals, who might have, by the way, voted differently. And the weird thing was, I was almost certain no one would ever know he did it. He was the guy who would go up in the elevator and not make any chit-chat, which is like against my religious principles to do that. And he ran his company through about 5 people, which fortunately included me, but didn't have a lot of, not a lot of pat in the back, not a lot of charisma. Just smart, high integrity. And he actually didn't care if anybody else knew. But from that day onward, I swore I'd work for him wherever he went. And I did in 2 major public companies. He cared about the institution and others before he cared about himself. He exhibited servant leadership at its best when no one is looking, even when no one knows you are serving them, and especially when it comes at a cost to you personally. Some of you may know him. He's Dennis Hendricks. I tell stories about him all the time. I used to interview Harvard Business School students and ask them what the greatest leadership characteristic was. And we as Christians might ask for something faith-filled, but that wasn't what we were trying to get out of people. And they'll mention vision and charisma and strategy and everything else, and 1 out of 100 mentions integrity. That's first, comes first, stays first, is first. And that's the power of what Dennis taught me. And he later ran several major companies in Texas, public companies. He wasn't trying to impress anybody. He just wanted to be able to live with a clear conscience. While he cared about his managers like me and the others, he cared way more about his sense of moral propriety. And he brought his values that he learned from his family in Jackson, Tennessee, and his faith, which was real and not hidden. And I thank him for his example to follow. Now, turning back to the full set of 10 values, once my management team group and I had articulated a mission and values, I started to talk to small groups, one after another, for 2 weeks after my arrival at the firm, and discussed only this mission and these values. I told them that I wanted to talk about what we stand for before we talk about what we are going to do. I could care less what the shareholders want. The team I'm going to make the shareholders happy with is in front of me. We got to get it right, talk about what our culture of integrity and caring and performance would be, and performance would be, and performance would be, before deciding what we were going to do. Third, I made a covenant with God, finally, that I would speak his name or refer to something spiritual in every group setting or public meeting at work. Owning what motivated my behaviors and my reason for working in business was liberating, not just for me, but for others of various faith traditions and spiritual beliefs. This held true in 2 multinational, culturally and religiously diverse, publicly owned organizations. And even, it seems, for those with a more humanist bent who wanted more from their work than just a job. My limited testimony wasn't a conversion exercise. It was simply an attempt to be an authentic leader, which people actually understand and I think actually appreciate, as opposed to being resentful of. Fourth, we started making promotions, demotions, and compensation decisions based on adherence to our 10 values. We literally had in our performance appraisal systems, how did they do against the values? Not just what goals did they achieve? Did they develop others? Did they lead others well? Did they live by our values? And we didn't allow strong technical, professional, or financial results to excuse bad behaviors. We wanted all those things, but they wouldn't come at the cost of the values of the organization, no matter how talented anyone was, including me. And I was the least talented. I didn't want to say that too loud. Fifth, we started 360-degree evaluations of all the leaders. Leaders first, did broad surveys of thousands of employees for feedback as evidence of our concern for the continuing health of the culture, a measure of progress on our commitment to virtuous and competent leadership, and to show everyone the dignity of their voice being heard. Sixth, in every publication and public setting, we took time to show how our actions occurred in the context of our values for the organization. The employee teams in these 2 institutions, and universally accepted and most often enthusiastically embraced this approach to their work lives. They were hungry for a spiritual purpose for their work. And I believe also hungry for a leader talking authentically about what motivated his or her actions at work. It released others in the organization to do the same. I don't think it's a coincidence that both large companies are still remembered as great places to work by those of many backgrounds who grace those organizations with their contributions. I also don't think it's a coincidence in both cases that we had uncommon success by secular standards. It was a competitive advantage to consciously and publicly integrate the sacred and secular purpose of our work in these two institutions. Now I'm going to turn to our spiritual journeys and make some further comments about integrating spiritual purpose into your work and academic lives. We are born with the option to choose magnanimity. How many of you have read Havard's book on magnanimity? You have? Okay, good. I thought it was a different word. I'm used to the word magnanimous. Now, you have to be born in 1954 to actually know what magnanimous means. It's usually people like Mr. Stewart who carries himself very humbly and doesn't show you how successful he is. That, to me, was magnanimous. Magnanimity is actually quite the opposite, and of course, the denotation is quite the opposite. The denotation, as you might get pretty rapidly, is magnificence. It's about daring to be great with the gifts that God gives you. It's the opposite of humility. Now, it shouldn't be done without humility, both metaphysically and inner human, but it is first the desire to be great with the gifts granted to you by the Master of the universe, and then to pursue a sacred mission of exercising those gifts for the benefit of his world. So leaders, future leaders like many of you in the room, never apologize for wanting to be great. Never. Make that positive impact on the world. It's, I believe, what we're put here on earth to do. But all people, especially the very gifted ones, are also born with a tendency to let success rearrange their mental picture of the world. And believe you, I have been through this, and I am a living example of how you can start to feel special and how much trouble it gets you into. Those blessed with the ability and energy to lead others, and it takes both, must recognize they embark on a perilous path for themselves and others, importantly, because power, self-adulation, and secular success will try to seduce us. It starts to make us feel special, that we are somehow superior to others, and nothing could be further from the truth. Our talents were given to us by God, and we will be humbled if we choose to interpret those as being given to us by other sources. That same omnipotent power will come back to reclaim something from you. We have to practice the cardinal virtues of temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice as we exercise those talents and enjoy the fruits of those labors. No matter what profession you pursue, including the blessed profession of parenthood, or what level you have achieved in that profession, there are several things of which I am convinced in terms of characteristics needed to succeed in today's workplace. One, it's a big competitive advantage to be guided at work and school by a strong spiritual commitment to your faith and spiritual beliefs. I guess I said spiritual twice, I apologize. It results in better decision-making, more trust from others, it truly does, and more self-worth. Without slipping into any distasteful endorsement of faith and prosperity, I also believe that when material goals and self-recognition are not the object of our work, we experience more of both than we ever dreamed of. Two, it doesn't hurt to enter each day with something like the Christian exhortation found in Ephesians 6:10 through 17. Does anybody read that passage very frequently? It's the one that talks about honoring your parents to start, which is kind of a cool way to start a verse. But then it goes quickly into who we are. We are soldiers of Christ as Christians. We arm ourselves with the shield of faith, the breastplate of righteousness, and the sword of the Spirit. It's a challenging world in which we all work and study. It's not an easy place. And we need to be prepared to fight the good fight for not just ourselves, but for others. 3, it helps at the end of each day to evaluate our success by looking only at the mirror, which to me is your family, their expectations for you, your expectations of yourself, the expectations of your loved ones, and God. And any other source for evaluating your day, if you search for it, discard it. It doesn't matter enough, and oftentimes it distracts us from our true purpose. And when we've done that, then we make the mental adjustments that are required for the next day to be a better person. 4, be eager to find moments to stand by a set of moral truths or virtues, which you will not violate. Especially when pursuing those might work against your self-interest, like we heard with Dennis Hendricks. That's magic. That's when more of salvation can be tasted and others can be best inspired by your good example. These moral moments, as I call them, exercise an essential muscle for all great leaders. They must possess moral fortitude amidst adversity. 5, don't be satisfied with a secular career without a spiritual purpose, which we've talked a lot about. Make your profession a sacred mission, whatever it is, because any profession done morally, justly, is a worthy profession. There is too much criticism of professions in this world today. I admire good academics. I admire good government officials. I admire good business people, good medical people. I don't try to figure out a way that they are less worthy than maybe one of the other professions could be. And yet we hear it all the time. Business comes under excruciating criticism for feeding the very system that most of those people work in. And being a college professor, I understand it, I hope. Being on the board of Baylor College of Medicine, I kind of understand it. The money comes from business. It's like hating a big brother. It's nice to be able to do it if they still love you. What if they stop doing it and stop loving you? Most great faith or philosophic traditions did not choose priests to make their mark on the world. They chose people like you and me to be their disciples, their messengers. Use your work at school and in your professions as a laboratory for practicing virtues, such as humility, fairness, temperance, kindness, and moral fortitude. Find and follow mantras in many great traditions, like the Christian tradition of the parable of the talents, where those who invested their gifts wisely were rewarded by their master, and the one who buried his gift was thrown out into the darkness where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. The universe doesn't want us to sit in our gifts. If you pursue business, be great in it. If you pursue medicine, be great in it. If you pursue law, be great at it. If you pursue being a parent, be great at it. The universe and God ask simply that any rewards from the exercise of our gifts be ascribed to grace as well as hard work, and should be devoted in turn to making the world better. 6, become reconciled with the need to make temporal judgments about others, such as criticizing their performance or behaviors, even asking them to work somewhere else. But be careful to keep a mental mindset that you are making temporal judgments, not spiritual judgments. Those are reserved for the Creator. Allow even the worst performer to preserve their human dignity during a painful process. You must love others even when you don't particularly want to work beside them anymore. 7, if you hit a flat spot in your professional or academic trajectory, which happens to every single one of us, use your faith or spiritual beliefs as a tool. While you are in a stalled period, pray for discernment about your future, and where possible, start to emphasize other sacred tasks, such as spending more time with your family or dear friends, or your faith, or philosophical development, helping out in the community, or practicing universally held virtues even more deeply every day. 8, take time every night to list the blessings you received that day. even for the little things, like someone complimenting your personal conduct at school or work, or someone who greeted you with a smile or a hug. Then you will go to sleep knowing that a force greater than you is indeed looking out for you, each and every single day. 9, pray every night for humility. And I am speaking to myself most profoundly here. So you may keep learning in life and not suffer the pain that improper pride brings to so many talented and successful people. 10, be a good follower even if you are a good leader. Allow people to invite you to do things they need done, especially those trying to be virtuous toward others. 11, if you find yourself in an ethical dilemma at work or school, personal life, just pause. Pause. Jonathan Haidt has a great comment about that. It's letting the rider take control of the elephant. And the old, I guess, saying about 10 seconds and waiting to get angry, there's a real application in life, especially in today's life. And just reflect on what might be virtue and truth before you respond, before you act. Then ask the one who caused you the ethical dilemma whether your view of truth and virtue is somehow misinformed. Give that person a chance to back away from causing the dilemma, or perhaps, strange as it may seem, explain a greater moral truth to you than you initially understood. If instead the ethical dilemma is caused by you, which is in some cases what I do to myself, perhaps due to your own temptations to greed, power, or organizational standing, then seek out someone you respect. That's why Bible study groups are great. And ask them to be a conscience to you. Give them a chance to explain to you what you should or should not do in this particular circumstance. Finally, in both cases, pray for discernment. 12, character and emotional intelligence are more important than IQ. Those who are most successful in their work combine skills and intellectual capacity with constancy, willingness to put team in front of individual, a deep commitment to serving others, including their families, and view their jobs as a vocation. They are without deception, humble, admit to their weaknesses, and care about societal progress, while having very high standards for the work excellence of themselves and others. These are not soft people. They have very high standards, and they insist on excellence. That's what you can do by being righteous and knowing you're trying to do the right thing in life. That's all emotional intelligence. It's having strong self-awareness, discipline, empathy, motivation, the social skills to work well and with and through others. I conclude by asking you to trust in something. Is Todd Montgomery in here? Toddy, you were the one who first told me about this, and I gave you credit for many years after I'd just trust in the law of the harvest. I know a number of you have heard of that term. We will reap what we sow. If you are good, and importantly, if you do good, not necessarily at every turn, goodness will follow you, certainly over the span of your education and career, and even more certainly in the arc of your life and an afterlife. Thank you for listening.